The proctor told us the gauntlet had never been wrong in 300 years. He said it the way you announce the weather. A fact so settled it doesn't need defense. 31 of us were standing in the intake ring, a half circle of polished black stone that hummed faintly underfoot, and every cadet in the room except me had grown up understanding what that number meant. 3 centuries, 0 null results. The gauntlet projected your score at the midpoint of your session. Projection was your score. Not a prediction, not a forecast, the record. I was the only human. I was also 17. I had been on the station for 9 days, and I was still adjusting to the gravity differential. Nobody had bothered to explain what projection meant to me in terms I'd find relevant. I assumed it was something like a progress bar. The gauntlet hall itself was a long corridor that narrowed as you walked it, the walls lined with recessed panels that shifted light, pressure, sound, temperature, the angle of the floor beneath your feet. The system read how you moved, how you breathed, how long you held eye contact with a stimulus before you looked away. It built a model of you in real time, and at the midpoint of your session, when the model was complete enough to be confident, it wrote the projection to the scoring board at the back of the hall. At that moment, the session continued, but only as formality. The score was already in the record. Every cadet who had ever walked the gauntlet had understood, without being told, that once the board lit, you could stop. The number was what it was. Proctor Assessor Verithsorn called my name first. That was unusual, apparently. Typically, the gauntlet sequenced cadets by prior assessment tier, lowest risk first. I had no prior tier. The intake office had processed me under a diplomatic exchange classification that didn't map onto any existing academic track, which meant I was simultaneously enrolled as a first-year cadet and flagged as an audit observation only. Nobody was quite sure which form superseded the other. While they sorted it out, Verithsorn put me first. The hall was longer than it looked from the entrance. I walked in at a normal pace, the way I'd walk any corridor, and the panels started shifting almost immediately. The first 20 meters were easy. Variations in light, tone that moved through registers I could mostly hear. A section of floor that tilted 3 degrees and then leveled. I kept walking. The air tightened slightly around 40 meters, and I realized the corridor width had narrowed by a third without my noticing. I turned sideways out of habit. I'd grown up on a trawler with passages too tight to take head-on, and kept moving. Around 60 meters, the temperature dropped. Not dramatically, but enough that the muscles in my forearms contracted. Put my hands in the pockets of my intake uniform, and kept my pace steady. My father had taught me that you don't speed up in cold water. Speeding up costs oxygen. You slow down slightly and breathe deliberately, and you outlast the cold because panic costs more than heat. The gauntlet, I would later understand, was reading all of that. It was reading the sideways turn and categorizing it as an adaptive response to narrow passage, stimulus. It was reading the hand placement and categorizing it as thermal management. It was building a model from approximately 47 physiological and behavioral data points simultaneously, and it was doing it very quickly, because alien cadets who came before me had provided it with 3 centuries of reference data, and every one of them had been from species whose behavioral response curves it knew intimately. The board lit at the midpoint. I saw it from about 30 meters away. A panel on the back wall that had been dark suddenly showed a single character in Velthian script, which I had been studying for 6 weeks, and could read at about the pace of a slow child. It took me a moment to parse it. When I did, I recognized it as a tier designation, the lowest tier assigned in this intake cohort, based on what I'd heard the other cadets comparing before we entered. I looked at it for a second. Then I kept walking. The gauntlet's panels went still. I had not encountered that in any of the orientation materials because nobody had thought to include it, there being no prior case where a cadet continued after the board lit. The system had a designed pause, a 1-second cessation of all stimulus, served as the signal. You had passed the midpoint, the model was complete, the score was written. The pause was the gauntlet's way of saying, you may stop. You have your number. I walked through the pause because I didn't know it was a pause. To me, it looked like a brief recalibration in the panel sequence, the kind of micro delay that happens in any system when it moves from one phase to Another, I assumed there was more corridor. There was more corridor. The panels resumed but differently. Later, Varethsorn would tell me, in language that struggled to stay neutral, that the gauntlet had entered a secondary protocol that no session in 300 years had ever triggered. It was called, translated loosely, the Extended Verification Branch. The system used it when the model detected a potential data anomaly, some internal inconsistency suggesting the initial scoring might be compromised. It was designed to run for approximately 4 minutes and then reproject with a corrected score. The walls changed angle. The floor pitched and recovered in a rhythm that was slightly off from any natural gait. The temperature swung, cold, then warmer than before, then cold again. A sound began at the edge of my hearing, not quite painful, the kind of frequency that makes your eyes feel dry. I blinked twice and kept walking. My family fished the North Sea. I had stood 8-hour watches in February with water breaking over the wheelhouse. Whatever the gauntlet was doing to the air pressure in that corridor was not February in the North Sea. The reprojection board lit at what I later learned was the 4-minute mark of the Extended Verification Branch. Same character, same tier. The gauntlet's model had reviewed itself and confirmed its initial read. The score was the score. I was still walking. I had covered about 80 meters of a 120-meter corridor. I had no particular reason to stop before I reached the end. The system entered a third protocol. This one had a name that translated as something between anomalous continuation and the more clinical phrase the Academy registrar used when she eventually explained it to me. Subject failure to terminate. In 300 years, it had been triggered twice, both times by mechanical faults in the panel system, never by a cadet. The floor began moving, not dramatically, a slow counter-directional current beneath the surface. Like walking on a very gentle treadmill pointed the wrong way. The light went flat, then strobed in a pattern too slow to be disorienting, but fast enough to break rhythm. The sound dropped into a register I could feel in my back teeth. I rolled my shoulders once, adjusted my pace to compensate for the floor's pull, and walked. I thought about my younger brother, who had a habit of setting impossible rules for games and then being furious when I found the boundary he hadn't specified. I thought about the trawler. I thought about the 9 days on the station and the 23 forms I had filled out, trying to resolve the enrollment classification discrepancy, none of which had produced a result, and all of which had been met with the same institutional patience that seemed to be the Kethville's primary emotional register. I was not angry. I was not frightened. I was mildly interested in whether the floor current would increase before I reached the end. It did not increase. I reached the end. The corridor terminated in a small circular chamber, 3 meters across, with a single recessed ledge and a token return slot in the wall. The token was a flat disc they had handed me at the entrance. I had been carrying it in my left pocket. I took it out and dropped it in the slot. The gauntlet's panels stopped. Every light in the corridor went to a neutral white. The floor steadied. The sound cut. I stood there for a moment, then turned and walked back out. Varethsorn was at the entrance. The observation ring was very quiet. The Proctor scoring ridge, a line of bioluminescent nodes that ran from the base of his neck to the top of his shoulder blade, which I'd been told glowed brightest when he was most certain of a result, was dark. Completely dark. The kind of dark that, in a Kethville, apparently indicated that the system of evaluation currently in use had returned no categorizable output. He looked at me for a long time. Then he looked at the scoring board, which still showed my initial projection. You continued, he said. There was more corridor, I said. He wrote something on his assessment tablet. Then he wrote something else. Then he set the tablet on the ledge behind him and looked at it, and then at me, and then at the corridor. The gauntlet, he said carefully, completed its assessment at the midpoint projection. The score is written. I know, I said. I read it. Another pause. His scoring ridge flickered. One node briefly, then dark again. You read it, he said, and continued anyway. I thought there was more corridor. He looked at me in the way that I had come to recognize. In 9 days on the station, as the look that meant a Kethval was performing a rapid and uncomfortable recalibration of an assumption they had not previously examined. It was a particular stillness, a held quality in the body, Like a system running a verification pass on its own model, the gauntlet cannot close a session, he said slowly, while the subject is still in the corridor. I thought about that. So my file is still open? File, Verisorn said, is in a state the system has not previously encountered. He picked up the tablet again. He was quiet for what felt like 2 full minutes. The other cadets in the observation ring did not move. I had the impression they were not breathing, though that was probably not literally true for all of them. The score that was written, he said finally, Flex, a model built from 300 years of reference data for species whose behavioral parameters are documented. He paused. You are not in the reference data. No, I said. I've been trying to sort out the enrollment classification for 9 days. He looked at me again. Then he made 3 entries on the tablet, one after another, each accompanied by a sound like something clicking into place. You will be reclassified, he said, pending review. Your gauntlet result will be logged as. He paused, searching for a phrase. Indeterminate pending species data acquisition. What does that mean for my enrollment? It means, he said, and his scoring ridge lit, all nodes, the full length, brighter than I had seen it in 9 days, that the gauntlet will need to be updated before it can assess you again. He handed my token back. I didn't know what that meant procedurally, but I took it. I walked back to the dormitory wing, thinking about the corridor, and the counter-directional floor, and the 3 secondary protocols that had apparently fired one after another, while I was just trying to reach the end of the hall. Thought about the board with my score on it. Still lit, presumably, still waiting for a session close signal. The system couldn't generate because I'd already handed back the token. My brother would have called that cheating. He would have been wrong. I hadn't changed the rules. Shh. I had just walked to the end of the corridor. The gauntlet had written a score for what it thought I was, and I had kept going, because where I come from, you don't stop before you reach the end. You stop when there is no more corridor. There was always more corridor, until there wasn't. The gauntlet's files, on me, stayed open for 11 more days, while the department argued about the classification. Eventually, they created a new intake category. I was the only entry in it. I still have the token.